For nearly 200 years, debates have raged over the origins of space, time, matter, and life. Before this, stretching back millennia, most people held to the belief that a divine being, somewhere in the heavens, was the creator of all things. But as humanity approached the 1800s, a shift began to take shape. After centuries of spiritual darkness, the Protestant Reformation brought an end to the Dark Ages in the 1500s. The Age of Reason followed on its heels in the 1600s, and the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. These milestones ushered in a period of profound transformation with technological advancements and scientific breakthroughs. These seismic changes challenged long-held beliefs, setting the stage for a new kind of discourse, one that questioned even the very foundations of existence and sought answers through reason, observation, and innovation. New metaphysical perspectives began to take root, while old philosophies resurfaced with renewed vigor. Idealism, transcendentalism, skepticism, postmodernism, rationalism, romanticism, pragmatism, theosophy, humanism, ecumenism, spiritualism, environmentalism, all emerging from the crucible of enlightenment directly or indirectly, they became the foundation for different moral perspectives and customs. This later led nations across the globe to fashion their governments, laws, schools, and social spheres according to their subjective interpretations of who or what they believed God to be. While some strongly believed in God, the man who claims the right to determine good and evil, others argued for God, the generated abstract construct that represents good and evil. Either way, these deeply rooted philosophies burst onto the scene with unimaginable social and religio-political force, reshaping societies and often leaving a crimson streak in their wake. The repercussions of these ideological upheavals would reverberate through history, altering its course forever. Why is this all connected? How is it all connected to the origin of space, time, and matter?
Now, why are we here? Now, the reason people ask for the purpose of their existence is because the purpose of existence is irrefutably linked to how we view the world at large. It's linked to how we live our lives day to day. It is linked to our morality as human beings. Now, there are two schools of thought when it comes to the explanation as to where did we come from. One school of thought suggests that when you observe the harmonious existence of species, when you understand the intricate designs and interactions of everything that exists in nature, it suggests that there must have been a designer, there must have been a creator. This school of thought tends to blend in with Christian belief that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. However, there's a second school of thought that seems to that also suggests that everything that existed, that is in existence, must have come to being as a result of chance. That things came together for no reason and created something that has risen.
Many ancient philosophers and religious figures have shared a common idea, that living by faith is inescapable. They believe that every person, whether they realize it or not, operates with some form of belief or trust, whether it's faith in the future, in other people, or in something greater than themselves, something that cannot be 100% certain.
Faith is inevitable. We all believe in something greater, something grander, something that is by nature higher than ourselves. But the act of believing in and of itself is not a virtue, and it adds no value to our lives unless what we believe in is truth. And so our greatest struggle as mankind is and always has been to identify a higher power that is trustworthy enough for us to cast all our burdens and cares, anxieties and excitements, our hopes and dreams, our futures and the futures of our loved ones. And most importantly, we look for a higher power to determine for us what is good and what is evil.
Now, the idea of an intelligent design seems to suggest that where there's a creation, there must be a creator. And where there's a creator, there must be a purpose. And so that is why the Christian belief brings into understanding the idea that there is a God who created us, and therefore God has a purpose for our existence, and therefore we find the purpose of our existence in the will of the Creator. If a bunch of inanimate things came together for absolutely no reason to create things with reason, how can we trust our own reasoning? It raises a question of morality. How do we decide as humanity what is right and what is wrong? It raises questions of where then do feelings come from? There's the feelings of love, the feelings of hate, the feelings of jealousy. Where do they come from?
The Big Bang Theory was first proposed by a Roman Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre, born July 17, 1894, in Charleroi, Belgium. The theoretical physicist suggested that the universe started as a primeval atom, smaller than the point of a needle, and then suddenly erupted into what we now know to be everything. This nothing to something idea gained further traction in the 1940s when a team of scientists led by Russian-American physicist George Gamow predicted the existence of cosmic microwave background radiation, believed to be the afterglow of the so-called Big Bang. Their prediction would be confirmed in 1965 by physicists Arno Penzias and Robert Woodrow Wilson, earning them the 1978 Nobel Prize in Physics, and further solidifying the general acceptance of the Big Bang Theory, even in its tremendously speculative form.
The small, sub-microscopic, almost nothing atom became everything. It is by far the most widely accepted explanation among scientists and scholars for the origin of space, time, and matter, despite its many logical, physiological, physical, biological, biochemical, mathematical, paleontological, geological, philosophical, and even astrophysical flaws and inconsistencies. So why do many people, including scientists, cling to it with such a miser's grip?
Proponents of the Big Bang Theory and evolution believe that it is such a fundamental truth that every other alternative explanation that should arise will have to conform to it for that alternative truth to be credible. The only problem with this notion is that almost every discovery about the universe, the age of the Earth, carbon dating, and other dating methods tend to move in a direction opposite to the Big Bang Theory and evolution.
The tenets of the Big Bang, that the universe started out small, hot, dense, where matter and energy were a primordial soup, where the forces of nature had merged. All of that is thoroughly supported by observations of this universe.
This is obviously not true.
Thoroughly supported. Okay? Now, there's some things that, well, did this really cause that? Or might it be something that we don't know about yet? And who ordered up the dark matter? We don't know where that came from. And where's this expansion? We don't know where that came from. But we can describe it and we can measure it. Here's the point. If tomorrow you have a new idea about how the universe works, it's going to enclose everything we've been talking about up to that moment that has been experimentally and observationally verified.
The same inconsistencies we will find in evolution theory, championed and popularized by Charles Darwin in his famous 1859 book On the Origin of Species. Darwin, a trained theologian with a keen interest in naturalism, biology, and geology, proposed that all species evolved from a single common ancestor, diversifying over time through natural selection. He didn't have a common ancestor story to go with the evolution theory. So for that, we can fast forward 25 years later to Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin and British geneticist John Haldane. They proposed the primordial soup theory. This is the idea that life on Earth miraculously began in a soup of organic molecules in the early oceans. Energy from lightning, volcanic activity, and the sun helped these molecules combine into more complex compounds, eventually leading to the first simple life forms.
We have never observed the emergence of life from lifelessness, yet the foundation of evolution theory heavily leans on this notion. Like evolution theory only works It only works if it contradicts science.
69 years later, American chemists Stanley Miller and Harold Urey conducted an experiment to test the oparin-haldane hypothesis in an attempt to prove that life can come from non-life. An idea that is so experimentally and observably impossible, neither the Miller-Urey experiment nor any modern experiment has come close to providing lightly convincing evidence of abiogenesis.
If you consider the statistical improbability of a complex system like the human brain and its ability to house and use one of the most, if not the most fascinating and little understood operating system called consciousness without a designer, you have to believe in miracles. Because it requires more faith to believe in miracles without a miracle worker than in miracles with one. At least faith-based religions that believe in a creator, intelligent design, at least they have both a miracle worker and a miracle, which makes the faith that much more reasonable according to the rules of logic. But the Big Bang believers only have miracles.
Evolutionary biologist and geneticist Richard Lewontin puts faith into naturalism in a famous statement, saying,
"It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door."
Okay, that is just a very smart way or complicated way to say this, but it's in simple terms, this is what he's saying. As scientists, we start with the assumption that everything in the universe can be explained by natural physical processes. This assumption isn't something we proved, it's just a belief we start with. Because of this, we design scientific methods and explanations that stick to natural causes, even if those explanations seem strange or hard to understand for non-believers. Based on this commitment to natural explanations, we intentionally avoid any theories or ideas that suggest a supernatural or divine cause like God. So what they are saying is they start with a belief.
Science teaches us about the space-time continuum. The very idea that time, space, and matter have to come into existence at the same time. Because if you had time and space but no matter, what would you put in it? If you had time and matter but no space, where would you put it? If you had matter and space but no time, when would you put it? And so the very idea of where did God come from, the very question, where did God come from, while it is a very relevant question, it reveals a very important thing, that we are probably asking about the wrong God. Because if God had a beginning, it would mean he is not God, because the Christian God is one who was not created. The Bible puts it plainly. He has no beginning, he has no end. He is from eternity to eternity. The very idea of God reveals to us that if there's a God that created everything, he would have had to exist outside of everything.
The Bible has been burned, banned, chained, decorated, and fiercely debated. It has undergone countless printings, reprintings, and translations, surviving empires, revolutions, and criticism. Despite this, it remains the best-selling and most widely distributed book in history, influencing law, morality, and culture across centuries. It has been called many things: divine, mythical, historical, but can it also be called scientific?
If God created everything, if we believe that we were created by an intelligent designer, then we believe that he must have a purpose for our existence. If he has a purpose for our existence, he must have a way of communicating that purpose to us. Every religion in the world that believes in a greater power, in an intelligent designer, has some form of communication with that said power. Christianity believes that God's way of communicating with us is through the so-called Word of God, the Bible. But a question then remains, because a lot of people still believe that since the Bible was written by humanity, how then can it be God's communication with humanity? The Bible itself claims that these very human beings wrote not what they thought, but they were inspired by the Spirit, which is the Spirit of God. But however, it still raises a question: how can we know? How can we prove that indeed these human beings that wrote the so-called Word of God were indeed inspired by God? How do we know that they didn't simply write things that would further their ends?
A religion whose content cannot be tested for historicity runs the risk of being nothing but a delusion. Christianity is not some harmless delusion, as many suppose. So faith in God and in the Bible's authenticity is underpinned by substantial historical and philosophical evidence.
The scientific method demands that. It demands that the proof of the concept must be found outside the concept itself. We cannot use the Bible to prove that the Bible is correct. That is what science requires. And therefore, is there any way we can prove outside of the Bible that the Bible is indeed the Word of God?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, these ancient manuscripts dating back over 2,000 years, confirm the accuracy of the Masoretic text, showing that the Old Testament texts have been copied with extreme precision over centuries, making the Bible's textual integrity remarkable, even according to the testimony of secular historians. The Tel Dan inscription. This 9th century BC inscription refers to the House of David, confirming that King David was a real historical figure. The Moabite stone. It mentions King Omri of Israel, verifying biblical accounts in 1 Kings 16:23-28. The Hittite civilization. Once thought to be a biblical myth, the Hittites were confirmed by archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries. Assyrian records. The annals of King Sennacherib confirm his campaign against Judah, aligning with 2 Kings 18-19. Babylonian chronicles. These tell of the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the Jews, as described in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52. Belshazzar, a figure mentioned in the book of Daniel, was long considered by scholars to be a biblical invention due to a lack of historical evidence. However, a series of archaeological discoveries over the past 2 centuries have substantiated his existence and role in Babylonian history. Nabonidus cylinders. Excavated from Ur, these clay cylinders contain inscriptions by King Nabonidus, who prays for, quote, Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, confirming Belshazzar as his firstborn. Nabonidus Chronicle. This cuneiform text reveals that Nabonidus spent a decade in Temur, Arabia, leaving Belshazzar as the acting ruler in Babylon during his absence. Persian verse account of Nabonidus. This document states that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his eldest son before embarking on his journey. The existence of Jesus itself is one of the most well-documented facts of antiquity. Apart from the Bible, non-Christian sources affirm his life and death. Pontius Pilate inscription. A stone inscription found in Caesarea confirms Pilate's role as governor of Judea as mentioned in the Gospels. Tacitus mentions Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate. Flavius Josephus references Jesus and his crucifixion. Pliny the Younger describes early Christians worshipping Christ as God. Many religious writings fail to pass the scientific test because a lot of their claims do not respect basic laws of nature, but here is how the Bible does. Geographical accuracy. Locations such as Egypt, Babylon, Nineveh, and Jerusalem are described with precise detail, matching historical maps. Medical and sanitary laws found in Leviticus show an advanced understanding of hygiene that predates modern medicine. The water cycle found in Ecclesiastes 1:7 and Job 36:27-28 described the water cycle accurately, long before modern meteorology. And most notably, the claim of a universal flood that wiped out all but 8 souls and a boatload of selected animals.
Geologists generally agree that the Earth was once covered with water, but claim it to have happened over millions of years, in phases, according to what they call the geological timescale. But how do you explain fish fossil, where one fish is actually swallowing another? You can't explain that. Or the presence of shark skeleton in mountain caves. How do you explain that? A shark skeleton is cartilage and not bone, and therefore takes a much shorter period of time to fossilize. Geology cannot explain fully the natural world without insights from the Bible.
It is argued that Noah's Ark, measuring 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high with 1.5 million cubic feet of space, was too small to accommodate the millions of species needed to account for today's biodiversity, as it could only house a few thousand.
Could Noah's Ark really fit 16 million animals? Firstly, Noah's Ark did not include aquatic animals, so about a third of that 16 million is gone. Also, another third of that 16 million are insects, which generally take up very little space. So even if we take away aquatic animals and insects, the Ark would still not fit 5.3 million animals, definitely not. And the answer actually is in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 14, where basically we are told that Noah took 2 of each kind and not 2 of each species. Right? In terms of the taxonomy, the pair taken in would be at family level and not at species level.
Despite the Bible's historical credibility, alignment with archaeological findings, fulfilled prophecies, and its focus on the only man who seemingly raised himself from the dead, it remains rejected in many cultural circles. This is understandable, as belief in the Jesus of the Bible depends less on objective facts and more on personal spirituality, one's willingness to submit to something as contrary to human nature as the love of God, regardless of the messenger or the recipient. And so Jesus is not just a historical figure, he claims to be the only path to God, the only path to righteousness, pitting him, his message and his followers against all inherited ideas of truth.
Inkolo yomlungu, ubuKristu, inkolo yabelungu, sizawutsho i-Pan-Africanists. So these guys generally accept the existence of God, but deny the Bible as from God. They perceive it as a colonial tool, as it were, to numb Africans from colonial resistance. You know, it is so ironic that they make this assertion when a large portion of the biblical narrative takes place in Africa.
Africa stands as a refuge, a cradle for major Bible figures. Abraham and Jacob's sons, driven by famine, turned their steps towards Africa with their backs turned against their hunger-stricken homes. And the baby Messiah himself, on the back of his parents, fleeing the politically charged massacre decreed by Herod, found safety on the soils of Africa.
The story of the Exodus, which God quotes throughout the Old Testament, takes place in Egypt, in Africa. In the Exodus, the news about the powerful works of the God of the Israelites traveled so far into the rest of Africa that some Africans left with the Israelites to Canaan. The Bible calls them the mixed multitude. Jesus himself spent a significant part of his childhood in Egypt, in Africa. As early as 330 AD, the Ethiopian ruler, Izana of Aksum, officially declared his kingdom a Christian monarchy. As a result, they built one of the oldest church buildings in the Ethiopian kingdom, and they built it underground, which is quite interesting. One of the oldest Bibles in the world, even older than the popular 17th century Bible, the King James Version, is the Karima Ethiopian Bible, which is a 4th century Bible. So Christianity and Africa are clearly inseparable.
African traditional religions are all monotheistic. uNkulunkulu, uMvelinqangi, Mudimu, Ramasedi, Mngari, Gainyame, Onkopon, all those names. They don't talk of a plural God.
This is not true. Several African indigenous religions, though recognizing a supreme being, worship other lesser deities. These often are incarnated in animals like chameleons, snakes, frogs, etc., and in natural elements like rivers, trees, mountains, springs, etc. These lesser deities are venerated as gods, being the supposed spirits of dead ancestors.
African traditional religionists claim that they worship the one true God, the Creator God, although approaching Him through other instrumentalities. As you study African spirituality, you will soon discover that most of them also honor a variety of lesser deities. Southern Africans call them Badimo, their dead ancestors, translated the gods. This hierarchy of deities is even more prominent in West and East African spirituality. It is the nature of pagan religions to have a hierarchy of deities. The supreme rules over the inferior deity. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, all ancient civilizations had a hierarchy of deities. So African spirituality is simply a continuation of the ancient theological worldview. For that matter, animal sacrifice and the burning of incense were major components of worship in virtually all these ancient pagan civilizations.
The Yoruba indigenous religion recognizes Olodumare as the supreme being, but also reveres deities called Orishas, many of whom are associated with natural elements. Oshun, the goddess of rivers and fertility, is worshipped at the Osun sacred grove in Nigeria. Ogun, the god of iron and war, is linked to forests and mountains. The Akan people of Ghana and Ivory Coast believe in Nyame, the supreme god, but worship smaller deities called Abasum, who inhabit natural elements. Tano, the river god of the Tano River, is one of the most revered deities in Akan spirituality. These African indigenous religions share a structure identical to all pagan traditions and bear a striking resemblance to Catholicism. The Catholic Church, known for its extra-biblical teachings, promotes the veneration of the dead, calling them saints. These saints, regarded as divine intercessors between God and humanity, are also deemed worthy of worship in their own right. Similarly, both Catholicism and African indigenous religions uphold the sacredness of relics, such as crucifixes, statues, and ritual objects. All these doctrines and more which are shared by the two originate from ancient pagan traditions and are not exclusive to any single culture or people.
When the white man found an African kneeling under a tree in prayer, they said he's worshipping a tree. There's no African religion that teaches Africans to worship their forefathers and their ancestors. Ancestors are a historical connecting cable to the creation that happened before we became.
This is also false. Joshua Maponga makes the inaccurate claim that there is no African religion that teaches Africans to worship their forefathers or their ancestors, but African indigenous religion scholars and theologians would disagree. Kenyan theologian and scholar John Mbiti writes in his famous 1969 book, African Religions and Philosophy, "The spirits of the departed continue to exist and to take an interest in human affairs. They are given offerings, prayers, and invocations because they are believed to influence the life of the living." Nigerian theologian Bolaji Idawu states in his 1973 book, African Traditional Religion, saying that Africans do not make a clear distinction between the living and the dead. The ancestors are very much a part of their world and are therefore honored and invoked. Ghanaian religious scholar Kofi Asare Opoku explains in his 1978 book, West African Traditional Religion, "For many African peoples, worship of God is closely tied to the veneration of ancestors who serve as intermediaries between the living and the supreme being. Professor of African Religious Traditions, Jacob Olupona, details it in a 2014 book, African Religions, a very short introduction. This is what he says. The worship of ancestors in African religious traditions is a form of acknowledging their continued spiritual presence and their role in guiding the living. So clearly, Joshua Maponga is completely off the mark when he says, quote, ancestors are a historical connecting cable. He seems to want to keep the ancestors dead in the ground. Yet the African religion scholars and even practicing worshippers of the African religions will tell you that the ancestors are alive and well. Not historical names that tie someone to the creator or creation, but active and concurrent, working in the present lives of their people, yet from an altogether different realm.
Praying to ancestors is definitely not equivalent to praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Firstly, these prayers were always offered to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and never the ancestors themselves. This phrase is not simply a recitation of Jewish ancestors, as many suppose, but it is a recollection of the covenant of God with these three specific patriarchs. Notice that the phrase has never been the God of John, of Jeremiah, and Isaiah, but always specifically the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in that particular order. This is because God made a covenant with each of these three patriarchs in terms of the advent of the Messiah.
And so the question is raised, did God create man or did man create God? If we have no purpose for our existence, we can tend to create our own purposes by creating a God. And so that is the argument. But however, Christianity then says, man did not create God, but God created man, and therefore the purpose of man is in the existence of God.
So the final question that determines how I as an individual move forward, the question will underpin my purpose and my sense of mercy and justice, my sense of good and evil, my ethics, my morality, is among several hundreds and thousands of gods out there, which God is the most reasonable to believe in?
Some atheists deny the existence of God because of their tragic personal experiences. So basically they struggle reconciling the existence of a loving and powerful God who also allows pain and suffering to continue. Although God is both infinitely loving and powerful, He's also infinitely wise. And He has at His disposal far more complex information from which to direct your life. And His infinite wisdom definitely knows better. So Christianity offers hope. Hope not just to Christians, but to the world at large. And this hope is particularly and especially with regards to the resurrection. There's no justice system that could resurrect a criminal that shot his wife and kids and then turned the gun on himself, and then be resurrected to face justice. There's no justice system that can resurrect someone to face the music. And so Christianity therefore offers justice and absolute justice, because God promises resurrection, that even if you kill yourself, even if you shoot many people and you commit mass murder and then turn the gun on yourself, you will still be resurrected and you would be required to face the music, to account for your actions. And so Christianity therefore becomes a beam of hope, not just to Christians, but to every victim of crime, every victim of horrible violence. And so I invite everyone. I invite pastors, I invite children, I invite the youth, I invite mothers, I invite the rich, the poor, everyone. I invite everyone, whether educated or not, to read for yourself the Bible. It's such a beautiful message. It has so many profound concepts that give us hope, that give us, energy, and they give us zeal, and they encourage us when we are down, because we then look forward to a time when justice is served.